Hello, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us, and big thank you to Rosie Lewis for joining us to deliver this session on how to bounce back when you don't get the funding. Rosie will be delivering the session in bite-sized chunks, and we'll be pausing at different intervals for some Q&A. Sorry, if you're not on mute, would you mind just popping yourself on mute for her? Thank you. So when we get to the Q&A sections, if you have a question, please raise your hand using the React button at the bottom of your screen. And you can come off mute and share that with us, or feel free to type that in the chat and we'll try to get to as many as possible. As I've just mentioned, please stay muted unless it's your turn to talk, just so we can try and make sure we can hear each other clearly. And finally, just to mention, there are links and resources for this session. So if you click on the resources button in the Zoom control bar, you can find those there. Over to you, Rosie.
Thanks so much, Rochelle. Hi, it's lovely to see everyone. I hope you've had an absolutely fantastic day at the conference. Brilliant speakers, brilliant workshops. Throughout this session, before I get started, it'd be really great if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat to each other. We don't have time to go around, and it's likely that people are going to be maybe coming in and out to the workshop. So it'd be great if you introduce yourselves. Please make connections, have a conversation over chat, you create new friends, partners, hopefully, for future funding, which is what we'll be talking about. So the whole point of this workshop is for us to have a very kind of innovative approach to how we deal with not getting funding. And I know exactly what it's like. I'm going to go into that in a bit in terms of my background and why this workshop has a particular resonance for me. But I think it's really, really important for us to just acknowledge it's frustrating as hell. It's very, very difficult when you're trying to run an organization and find the capacity to be able to be applying for funding. And it's also really, really frustrating when you put your heart and soul into something and you're supporting all the women and girls and children that you support. And then obviously you get knocked back. My approach with this, there are so many workshops about applying for funding, approaches to funding. I'm going to take a slightly different approach to this, because one thing that I've come to learn from doing so much fundraising and from being involved in women's organizations is that your uniqueness as an organization is probably your biggest selling. Well, it is definitely your biggest selling point. So having confidence in that and belief in that is such a huge part, I think, of bouncing back or making sure that you're going to get funding in the future, because you know better than anyone how much the women and girls in your services need that funding. Thanks. I think I've frozen again here. Oh, here we go. Great. So we're going to kind of have 4 sections. As Rochelle said, I thought, I really don't want to speak at you for 45 minutes. So we're going to have like 10-minute sessions, 10 to 15-minute sessions, hopefully have a bit of an opportunity for questions or if you want to make comments. But please, in between, if anything's coming to mind, or you've got any questions, please put them in the chat. And then when it comes to the breaks, we can have a bit of a discussion about the questions or some of the issues that are being raised. Obviously, it's only 45 minutes. I'm not going to cover everything, but I really hope that I cover some of the kind of guiding principles and give you some inspiration to get back on your feet after being knocked back. So the first part of it, we're going to be looking and kind of addressing and recognizing the impact. Because actually, every time you get turned down for some funding, it does impact you. It impacts, I think, it can impact confidence. It can impact issues around all the capacity you've put and all the time and energy you've put into it. And it makes you query whether you should be doing that work in the first place or how that project looks. But also, I think it has a real impact on the team as well, because often you'll have been reliant on applying for that bit of funding. And if you don't get it, then it can have an impact on your organization, your ability to deliver services. Then we're going to look at kind of learning and reflection and how they're really good tools, as cliched as those phrases are in our sector, but they're really good tools to think about, why didn't we get the funding? What do we need to look at? How do we analyze the last funding and move on? I'm going to really, throughout this session, deter you from doing this kind of, well, we didn't get the funding, let's cut and paste to the next application. I'm going to try and deter you from that. I don't think it necessarily saves a lot of time because every funder has a different way of framing the questions. But also, I think it really helps you to keep freshening up and making your project seem like it has to be funded. And that's the perspective I'm coming from. All of the work that you do is no doubt absolutely critical and vital for the women and girls that you support. So really, what we need to present to funders is there isn't a choice whether they fund this. This has to be funded to be able to support the women and the girls and the children. Then we're going to have a bit of a discussion about strengthening your infrastructure, because every time you get knocked back, sometimes there can be some practical things. And I think if we all reflect, you know, I've worked in women's organizations for decades and stuff, we all reflect this, we're never perfect. There's always something we could be strengthening that helps us to build up our ability to better present the next application and to better evidence it as well. And then we're going to talk about next steps. I'm a very pragmatic person. So although we're talking about principles, I hope some of this is practical and useful to you. Okay, so I'm just going to move because I can see this. I love this picture. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It's just been in the Women Revolt exhibition with that bone kicking. And you know what? We are, and we have to remember that. So a funder turns us down. What do they really know about our services anyway? Like, I wouldn't want you to feel like that should ever put you off your stride. And it really shouldn't be knocking your confidence around the work you do or the work that you know has to be done for the women, girls and children. Sometimes there can be a better way of presenting it. Sometimes there might be some, you know, infrastructural issues that need to be addressed, but you know the work is absolutely needed. And I think I would say to you, like, how do you feel when you get a kind of knockback? What are your initial feelings about that? Because something we don't talk about a lot when we're doing very kind of bureaucratic type things like applying for funding is that it can really have an impact on us, especially when we're in leadership roles and we have that responsibility of carrying forward our organizations. You can share that in the chat if you want to, but that might be a really useful thing to share with others. But like, how does it make you feel? I know that, you know, when I've had knockbacks, especially for some of the projects I've been doing, say, for example, trying to make sure we've got funding to support women without recourse to public funds in refuges, because they can't go to mainstream refuges, trying to make sure we've got therapeutic support in place for children, trying to make sure that we've got food for women because they're not able to like feed their children adequately based on the income that they've got. You know, it can really have a personal impact on you. So how do we make sure that we think about that, all of the context of the work that we're delivering, the knockback that we've had from not getting this funding, the fact that it might affect things like how many hours our workers can be working, it might affect the services we're delivering as well as women and children.
Hi.
Joshua,
sit down in one place, please.
I think children are
I'm
coming out, which is totally
just off before I can see you.
I think Michelle's going to put on mute. Thanks, Rochelle. Managed to? Great. Okay. So how do we make sure that we're going to reserve our energy and reset and recalibrate? Where are we going to get our resilience and resistance from? Now, I would say, first of all, we're going to get that from our internal kind of team, our structures. We're going to remember, and from the women and the children that we're supporting, we're going to really remember the reason why we're doing what we do. And we have to find a way to move on. And yes, I know, like I've said, learning is such a cliche, but I think very rarely do we ever take time to go back to a bid or to look at a bid and think, what wasn't working in this? Why maybe would we have not got the funding? Sometimes it's not an arbitrary decision from a funder. And then also I want us to look at kind of how we're going to make sure that we're adapting to the changes that not getting the funding is going to have. I always think when we're putting in funding bids, we have to have a bit of a backup plan for what happens if we don't get the funding. And I think you can actually build that into the way that you're approaching your fundraising too. So click through. Okay, I love this quote from Audre Lorde. I want us to remember it. So we're powerful because we've survived, and that is what it's all about, survival and growth. And I have to say, one of the things is I started to go from being demoralized when I didn't get funding to really having a fighting attitude and being like, well, no, look at this amazing work we're doing. look at what the women have gone through, because I've mainly worked in violence against women and girls services. You know, let's really look at how brilliant our workers are and what we do. We know we're brilliant, and we know what we do is critical and vital. Therefore, and we also, as an organisation, and the women have survived so much. So how are we going to use that power to be able to move on to next funding? And that might sound a bit over dramatic in relation to a funding bid, but actually I think you have to have this kind of attitude, because it really can shape the way that your funding bid comes together. When you're on the other end, and I have done a bit of being on the other end of receiving funding applications, when you receive a funding bid that's really fighting for the women and children, that's really speaking out about how much this funding is needed, it does make a massive difference to your approach. It isn't always about having the best funding bid. So I want us to start with a review, a bid analysis. So we haven't got the funding. We've been turned down. It could have been for a really big bid. It could have been for a smaller level bid. It doesn't really matter. Either way, we'll have put a lot of work into it. So what are we going to do? I know we never have time in our organisations. I know it's very difficult for us to find time for reflection. But if you start to turn this on its head a bit and think about how, if we can find a bit of time to review a past bid, it actually gives us more capacity and ability to do the next bid. If we can analyse and understand what we haven't done right when we approach the next bid, we're not wasting any time going down, you know, into different kind of cubby holes and down different rabbit holes of direction, trying to second guess what a funder wants. So I really would encourage you, and it doesn't have to be for a length of time, but I would ask you, how many of you have actually reviewed or analysed a bid that hasn't been successful? Because I never used to do this for years, and then before I started doing it. So I would really encourage you to be reviewing the bid with colleagues. If you can, it might just be with like a senior team, or if you're a volunteer-led team, you know, other people that have been in tune with or have informed the bid. Sometimes it can be advocates or workers who've helped to form some of the ideas about why that bid was needed. So it's good to have a bit of a review with others. In the women's sector, in our sector, we are brilliant at collectivist work. It's where we get our strength from. We get our strength from each other and from the women. And I would say that the same approach applies in relation to going for funding. We need to cross-reference the criteria. What I mean is by this, because this will really help your next bid, is go through with a fresh head or the criteria, the exact criteria that you're expected to cover, and see if your bid actually hits every mark. Because usually when you receive a bid and it doesn't hit all of the criteria mark, even if it's a really good bid, because it hasn't made direct reference, even though when you're writing it, you think it would be really obvious and like they should understand that obviously it inherently holds it. I think a good way to approach it is as if somebody who has never ever stepped into a women's service would understand what you're doing. How would you explain that to them? So going back to that criteria and really clearly explain that is really helpful. And actually, when you're applying for funding, it's the number one thing you make notes against. I would really, really encourage you to do that, because that informs the framework of the bid and the way that you're going to approach your next bid, which we're going to talk about. Review your documents and evidence. Sometimes it can be really simple things. Sometimes it's really, really simple things like, because remember, especially with bigger funders, you're quite often going through a bit of a filter process. So for example, if your safeguarding policies aren't quite there, or you haven't submitted a particular policy that you should have done, or maybe there was a certain kind of criteria around your funding and you just needed to better explain that maybe this year you have got this amount of funding, but you haven't got the annual accounts, but last year it would show that you had less income, etc. So it is always good to do that, because you might not always get feedback from a funder about why you didn't get through the first filter. Revisit the framework. We're going to talk about frameworks. It sounds like a fancy word, but basically it is writing notes on a piece of paper to say, how do we want to approach this bid? What are going to be the key tenets or components of the bid we want to put in? And the key thing I would say, particularly for funders now, because there's been such a revolutionary change, thank goodness, in how they approach stuff, is Where are the women, the girls, the children? Where are they in your bid? Are their voices there? Are they centralized in it? Obviously, you know that you center women and girls in all of your work, but actually, if you don't explicitly say that, a funder's not going to presume that. Right, I'll go on to the next one. It's freezing a bit, this, so excuse me. Here we go. Reflection. So yes, we've looked practically at what we've done. We've had a bit of an analysis. It wouldn't take more than about an hour and a half, and having a bit of a discussion with your team about maybe what could have been better in the bid, what didn't work, the way you could think about moving forward, what could be strengthened. But I think it's also good to have a bit of reflection time. Not straight after you've reviewed the bid, but just a bit of reflection time with those people that you've talked to about the bid. And to think about your organisation, like, actually, we're put in for this funding, but is it still relevant and needed? Even if we got the same kind of opportunity through a different funding programme, actually, is it still relevant? Do we need to tweak it? Is it that, say, for example, you've realised that loads of women now you need to make sure you're providing bus fare for them. Do you need to better explain that in the next bid? What could you do differently? Yep, so that's a really good one. Have you gone through your bid analysis and then clearly seen, actually, we could have strengthened this bit, this bit, this bit. We could have maybe used some women's quotes. We didn't, that kind of level and stuff. Were there any obvious gaps? Now, obviously, that means like things that you've gone through the criteria of the original bid. You're like, God, we really didn't say anything about that. And believe me, it's so easy to do. None of this is about criticizing the way you've approached it. When you're under a lot of pressure, you've got a lot of stuff going on. I've spent my life working through the night to get bids in, as I'm sure many of you have, and there's never enough time. Sometimes there can be a real obvious gap. And the final thing I would say is an internal systems review. Now, this spills over a bit from your reflection about the actual bid, and I think it spills over more into thinking about whether your systems need a bit of tweaking. So, for example, if you had to give a safeguarding example of something which quite often funders ask for, asking how you made sure that people were safe when there was a safeguarding incident. Actually, when you looked at it, you can see that maybe some of your internal systems need to be strengthened. And maybe that's a bit of a bigger piece of work that your organisation would have to do anyway, that might not be just to do with the bid, but it might help you in the future. Okay, so, it seems to be going. Oh, here we go. Okay. So I'm going to open this up to you now. I mean, I don't know whether there's any questions. I can't see the chat because I'm so busy looking at the presentation and trying to go through it. Has anybody got any comments? Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to say so far?
There's no questions yet in the chat, but do feel free to type them in there or to raise your hand using the reaction button at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah. Simon. Hi, Simon. Please come in, Simon, and then we've got Polly. Oh, you're on mute still, I think, Simon.
Sorry. Hello. Hi. Nice to see you again. It's the question is really about, everything that you said. I always do like this draft with lots and lots of information, then go to the bid, and we never have enough word count to say what we need to, and that's where it gets challenging. So it's around that element. If you could, when you get a moment.
Yeah. And actually, there's so many elements I haven't included in that. So I'll briefly say it now rather than leave it till the end. What I would briefly say about that, and I've done so many bids and I've been in the same position as many of you in women's organisations, and I know there's never enough time, but honestly, edit is absolutely the key to that. There are little tricks like putting slashes in between words, which makes it one word. So if you're down to like 360 and you can't get rid of 10 words for 350 word count, there are little tricks like that. And there are ways of just, if it's a very fine word count, I think the funder would appreciate that you could do short script. They're not asking for you to write like in the style of War and Peace, or to write a really good narrative. But I think that edit, because what you find is if you could allow yourself a day between, and I would say really 3 edits would be ideal. If you could allow yourself a day, or even ideally like, you know, more than a day between, every time you go back, you'd go, oh, that's repeated. Oh, that, oh, we could shorten that. Oh, we could focus on that. And I think, again, I'd go back to the criteria very quickly, just to say that the criteria, go back to the criteria if you've got too much a word count, because don't put anything extra in. Simply just don't, because often there'll be a second stage anyway, where you can better explain things. So I hope that's helpful. Thanks. And Polly?
Hi. Just going back to the first part of your presentation, Rosie, about how you feel when you've been rejected, and I'm currently feeling really crap.
Sorry. Yeah.
All the reasons that you've highlighted, but we're working on such an unequal playing field. Rosa's report recently showed that buying for specialist services, whether it's buying for women, Black people, LGBT, etc., make up 86% of the entire org sector, yet we're fighting for 3.4% of the entire org budget. So we're already at a disadvantage. The Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office has already cited that buying for services are 5 times more likely to be rejected than larger white-led organisations. And so we're constantly battling where the playing field isn't equal. And I think part of that is, I think the funders are responsible for that as well. As was said, you know, word count, criteria checks. I was due to put in an application, and I did the contact us to get some more information. And I was quite clearly told, don't bother, it's a waste of your time. He hadn't even seen the application. So if we're trying to work towards empowering women to support women and girls, and this is the attitude that we're getting,
it's
I kind of feel hopeless.
You're completely right, Polly, and I think it's good to have these conversations, and I hope you've got other people to talk to. You're absolutely right. It's a complete unequal playing field, and like I've worked, you know, consistently in Black minoritized-led women's organisations. I know the racism, the inequality that goes on, the way that you're pitted against other organisations. I also know the tricks of some of the generic organisations, all that kind of stuff. But what I want to kind of really push, and again, I've only got 45 minutes, I wish I had longer, but what I want to really, really push is and I'm going to talk about this, is we need to use that disadvantage to become a power. Because the power of that disadvantage is that you have the evidence that there are so many inequalities. And actually, one thing I would say is that there is a level of transparency and accountability that funders have to have. Believe me, I don't think the majority of them are there. But there are ways to challenge this. And I think one of the things I would, you know, really wish I could support you with more is around how you're able to sort of strategically embed that into your next plan. So, for example, what I started doing, because in the one organisation that I was in, you know, we were doing Vogue work for decades, never got any funding. Again and again and again. And things changed because things changed in the general kind of climate of things. But one of the things we did was we were actually naming the fact that we weren't getting funding. So I'd be like, right, great, didn't get funding. You know, I'm using that as a massive piece of evidence of inequality. So think about how you can use that as evidence towards your next bid. And believe me, I'm not saying it's a catch-all, but it really, really can help. And it does work with a lot of funders. I would also say that another trick in terms of thinking about inequality is to think about the region or the locality that you're in, and think about how that inequality fits in to the way that, you know, that regional setup. So, for example, in the northeastern parts of the region, there's virtually, you know, the statutory services have less than 5% Black and minoritized workers, right? So that would seriously impact the possibility of, you know, Black minoritized organisations getting funded, getting involved in multi-agency work, and actually being treated equitably. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a taste of stuff, but I hope that there's some stuff later in the presentation where I'm going to talk about strategic stuff and how important it is that might help you as well. Peter's next, and then Noor.
Hi, going back to your thing, there's 4 things that I kind of look for first when looking at my applications. The first is I have to be honest. Am I applying to the right one? Do I fit their criteria? If if I massage what I'm doing to fit their criteria. So I have to do a lot of research first to pick the right ones. That'll improve my chance. The second thing I do is I think it more like an elevator pitch. So if I go into a lift and I had 30 seconds to tell them, try and keep it short, sharp and snappy so they really get it. They see lots of these, so I like to get it so they can really get the true story. The third thing I do is I ask a friend who is not associated with the organization to read my application. If they get it, the funder gets it. So if they don't know, if I'm using too many acronyms or I've done stupid things, they'll spot it. And the last thing I do is we all work for women and girls organizations. I host several coffee mornings where we do peer reviews and we help each other out. So if someone else, I've seen it so many times, is anybody applied to such and such an organization? Have you got any tips or any tricks or anything like that? We should work closely together, helping each other.
Yeah.
And I think the more we can do that, and I peer support about half a dozen different organizations that are not directly in competition, and we review each other's work. We lean on each other's shoulders, and we share our successes and our miseries together. And this helps keep us kind of motivated and moving forward.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think collectivism has very much come from the women's sector, and I think we're very, very good at that. So thanks for reminding us about that. Noah, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Rosie. I just very quickly say that I really feel with and for Polly. I like for us, for example, just what we struggle with. So we are a diverse-led women's organization, and we're based in Cornwall. So our problem is trying to explain to big funders like the Lloyds Foundation, who have rejected us now for the second time. This time they gave us feedback, so I couldn't help myself. So I did kind of write back to question the reason they gave us, and then they replied again, clarifying a second reason, which was the fact that they looked on our website, and from what they can see, we do not look like we support Black and Asian and ethnic minority women. So although in the application I had explained that this is a Cornwall-based organization where ethnic minorities make up 3.2% of the population, and arguing the case that because of that, services that support this very small minority are even more needed than anywhere else, because, places like London, Manchester, Birmingham, all the other, bigger towns and cities, I guess, have the infrastructure, have better infrastructure than Cornwall has. And so we are quite behind in terms of that kind of stuff down here. And so it makes our service really vital. And then on the other side of it, you have a national funder who told an organization we work with closely that they have already funded a Black organization, and so they cannot fund another one locally. So you have so locally can't be funded because then you've got trying to get funding from outside, and it's just.
I mean, I'm not having to go at the funders. I'm always very mindful about what I say, but that seems like clear discrimination. Number one, what I'd say about you in terms of what does your constitution say? If your constitution says Black minoritized women can present in many different ways. I think relying on a website is a very bizarre thing for a funder to do. Not that I'm saying anything against Lloyds. I don't know the full picture, but I think what I would reply is say, well, our constitution, or whether it's unincorporated or incorporated, says this. So therefore, that's a strange conclusion to come to. In terms of national funders, yes, we went through that a lot. It goes back to what I said before, which is use it as a superpower to say, actually, that's inequality and discrimination. And I think it's very much worth going back to bigger funders and challenging them, and it does work. We found it can take a bit of time, but we found a turnaround of about a year or two where they came back to us and went, we reflect on this, and this wasn't great. Okay, so I'm going to move on, and then what I think we'll do is we'll go through the rest of the slides, and then we'll do 5 to 10 minutes at the end, because I think the questions are actually probably going to be more useful than the presentation, or maybe they'll go side by side if we're lucky. Okay, so this is what I want you to really, really think about and consider, right? I have found that my creative approach to fundraising has been nothing but a benefit. Being really creative about the narrative that you want to tell you know, and when we say narrative, we mean, you know, the women and children and the girls and the story of your organization, which obviously is the truth and the holistic truth of everything that you do, but we'll call it a narrative for now because that's what you're presenting really. Yeah. There's three tenets to this to me. There's creativity in your approach. That's your innovation. You wouldn't exist if you didn't have a very unique way of supporting the women and girls that you support. And sometimes that can be drilled down. Okay, you might do Vogue advocacy like a lot of other organizations, but I bet the way that you do it is so different compared to the local generic organization. The diversity, I have not a doubt, and people have spoken to it already, you know, as a grassroots community-based organization, the diversity of what you do will be vast compared to other organizations. A good tip around this is consider who has the local commissioning and the big pots of funding. Look at the diversity, take a good look at the diversity of the people that are accessing those organizations, particularly women and children. I think what you'll find is there's a lot of discrepancies, and that's your evidence base for the need for your organization. Even if they get the big load of commissioning, it works very, very well with charitable funders to be able to see that level of evidence and need. And then also your vision, because actually that bid is part of your bigger vision. And I think that's been alluded to by a few of the people who had questions and came in with some of their thoughts and comments. You know, it's really important that obviously everything you do is within the context everything you apply for is within context of the work that you do. But I've never really found something that didn't fit while being absolutely true to what we were doing. Because the thing is about women and girls organizations, we do holistic work. We pretty much do everything for the women and children we support, which others don't do. So actually thinking about the bigger vision of what you do can be really, really helpful. Important questions to ask yourself, I think, as you're going through, moving on to the next application. So now we've done the reflection, we've done the kind of learning, hopefully, and we're thinking about, okay, we need to pivot, and this is what we want to apply for now. I think it's been mentioned before, but I'm going to say it again. Who do we work with? Who do we collaborate, co-support, co-produce, develop consultative partnerships with? What I would really, really stress is absolutely be true to your values and your ethics as an organization. You don't need to be a sub-partner. Don't get forced into subcontractual situations which ethically don't align with you because you've got a big player in town who's quite bullying, takes up all the funding and the commissioning. Actually sticking to your ethics and sticking to what you do and having clear boundaries around it is a very strong sell to funders. So be really clear. So yes, this is about who you collaborate with, but there's nothing wrong with being very, very boundaried about who you're going to work with, because you've always obviously got to centre the women and the children. Funders, okay, people were talking about being really frustrated with not even really frustrated, you know, possibly feeling that they've been discriminated against in terms of not getting funding. You know, work with your board, work with others, construct a really well put together letter challenging, because actually a pro-social challenge, as in one that is well founded and helps the funder to better understand and recognise the context that you're working in, which, to be honest, they won't necessarily understand, particularly if it's in a region outside of London. If we're going to be honest, a lot of funders don't necessarily have regional people, some do, some don't. Build a relationship with them. You could have a negative response, but actually having a conversation with them about it, and actually working with a funder who's willing to have a conversation says a lot. If a funder is willing to have a conversation, to reflect, to consider, to write back, even better, to pick up a phone, then that's probably a funder you want to work with. And when they know the work that you're doing the next time around, you can always go to them before when a funding stream comes up. And I would also encourage people to have to understand that they can actually contact funders when a funding stream comes about. They can ask questions. They don't just have to attend the presentation that they give. It's very valid. And also while you're doing that, you're able to give that funder a better understanding of the context that you're working in. And then there's the program, you know, as in the program, the funding program itself. As we've said, you've got the criteria, but drill down the details. The first thing I do is pull apart whatever the funding program criteria and ask is. You know, you'll find that you'll find a way to hit every mark. But if you list what all of those, the ways that you can hit every mark, when you write it, it's really amazing how you absorb that information because you've already sort of thought about it and ordered it. So when you go to write it, actually it really comes through strongly and it gives you something to go back to. So you're not just holding these vague thoughts in your head, you actually have something written down that you can practically go back to and go, oh yeah, oh, I forgot to say about this is what the women do and this is why we need this. So it's a very useful tool. I think that this for me is it's almost your background. This is your background kind of work that is ongoing, but that needs to take place. So we had a discussion, and I'm really, really grateful for some of the issues that were brought up. They're horrible challenges, and I'm really, really sorry about them. But they really inform this kind of bigger picture thinking, right? Because actually it's important for you to take the fact that, you know, people didn't understand what the context of working in Cornwall was. People didn't understand that how many women you were supporting who are at a absolute, you know, critical point in their life where they need vast amounts of support that nobody else has given them and only you are providing it. Well, actually, we need to be out there. We need to have our strategic voice heard. We need to have our voice heard about what's happening. We can't wait for a funding application. And I know most of you will already be doing this, but there's something about specifically, again, using that to empower yourself for the next phase. And it's almost like, well, actually, we got turned down for this reason, but that shows up an inequality or an issue that actually funders and people who are local strategy people are not seeing. So we need to go to this meeting and make this known. We need to share this data or this statistic. We need to get our voice out there and keep up that understanding, have a visible presence with it. Just put, you know, a few quotes or a few stats up on social media. It's a 2-minute job. That kind of thing, like flash points that when or even on your website, so that when a funder is looking, they can see that stuff is there and existing. And they do checks, like somebody said about their website. I mean, I think that's quite a challenging thing to use the reason to not get funding, but you know, it just does show that funders are looking at the whole picture around your organization. We need to find allies. So, you know, sometimes we can look at a system or an aspect of a multi-agency kind of dimension that we have to work with consistently that is troublesome. There can be many. It can be police, children's social care, local authority, etc. But what I started to realize, and working with colleagues, we started to realize was even though we might have been continually having a challenge, say, for example, children's social care, actually we'd find a couple of workers there who really understood where we were coming from. Actually, we'd find a local authority person who was in regular meetings with the local funding officer who understood a bit more. So finding those individuals, and they are there, who really want to better understand and have that willingness and that want to see the women and the communities that you support, make sure that they're getting equitable funding and support and making sure that their needs and concerns are heard. It's a very, very useful tool for you, and it can really support things because you know what it's like in your region. You know, the power brokers, a lot of them know each other. They have regular meetings. You know, if you have regional funding officers, they will have meetings with, they will know local authority people. They will know people from other bigger organizations. So it's really worth starting to kind of make those relationships to help to found your strategic voice and influence locally. Importantly, these two aspects, right? You are the experts. Don't let anybody knock you off your horse with that one. You really, really are. Nobody is able to work with the women like you do. Nobody knows the women and children like you do, or else they wouldn't be coming to you for support. Yeah. So have surety with that. And even if people are trying to sideline you, discriminate against you, you're going into, you know, you might be going into strategic meetings, you know, support each other within your organization collectively to have that confidence to keep going forward and just saying, no one's going to knock us from this, because you wouldn't be doing, you certainly don't do this work for the career prospects of the money. You do this because you passionately believe in it and you believe in the women and children's rights. So take that focus into every meeting you go into. And then women's voices. I think this is a constant thing that our organisations are built on the women and children's voices. But I would say sometimes it's very easy because of word count, because of issues, for them not to find a way into our bids. I mean, a way around things, sometimes it goes back to maybe building up that relationship with the funder. Why not send a case study and say, this is what we're dealing with, when you send a letter back saying, well, we didn't get funding, but actually, just so you know, this is what we're dealing with. Why not kind of, you know, make sure that a survivor testimony or a link to a survivor's testimony, or maybe some event that you've done with survivors, it could be embedded into your application at some point. It's quite easy. That's quite a good way. Sorry, that's another shortcut as well, is if you want to reference some of the work you've done in a bigger scope, obviously just embed a link within your application as well. But make sure that the women and children's voices are there. And that's like, I think that's a really, really important tip, as well as your confidence around you being the experts. And then I'm just going to do this final slide before we have a conversation, because I want to leave like 10 minutes to have a discussion, because I think that they're really fruitful. It's been really fruitful so far, I think, for everybody. And that's the next steps, right? So I know I must be sounding like a right pain in the backside. Just come on, let's keep our spirits up. Let's keep going. Let's bounce back. I'm really not underestimating how devastating it can be when you don't get the funding that you're really, really reliant on. However, again, I'm going to say we need to kind of harness that, reframe it, and it's going to be the thing that keeps us powered. Because I bet you can get a funding decision and you step outside your office and you see a woman and a child, and and you see what your organization does for them, and your mood is completely changed. And that's what we need to keep focusing on. So first of all, let's think about the organization. Just to recap on where we are with things, right? If we're going for the next bid, our organization, we start with that. Our organizations have to be strong. We have to present good evidence base, a good structure. We have to have everything in place so that everything is ready to go. So for example, if you found that one of the gaps that you had was around your policy, it's a really common thing. All of us have it. Sometimes funders ask for very bizarre policies and they're just like, you're just like, what is this policy about? But they do occasionally. It's like, make yourself a file of all the policies that you're going to regularly need, build up that receptacle, so you're ready to go. Make sure that everything's up to date. So for example, if you've got like safeguarding, if you've got violence against women and girls policies, they're going to need to have the Domestic Abuse Act framed in them, for example. Just little touches like that don't take long, but can really strengthen stuff. So it's that quick service check. What do you need to consider? Are there any changes? And what is the team that you're going to need? So if you are applying for funding and you've got an opportunity to put in, you're at a second stage, or you're putting in a bigger scoping piece of funding, or you're thinking, oh, actually, we've decided rather than that project, which we didn't get the funding for, we want to reframe it and think about a different way of doing that project, then you kind of think ahead what you're going to need to do it. Make sure you build in adequate capacity and funding. I think sometimes what happens is funders get applications and they just seem a bit too much compared to where the organization is. So actually it's not a bad thing, having lesser numbers, having a bit more of a realistic vision based on where the team is and what you actually where you actually are. But it's also good to think ahead about what you're going to need, because I think often we think we want more workers, we want more projects, but when we get them, we're like, oh my gosh, it's way more than we could have ever imagined. So try and get yourself prepared if you're applying for a project that is going to be a new type of project. Then step 2 around the organization are the skills and gaps, as I've mentioned, the stuff about the policies, the systems, but also the partnerships and the strategy. Yep. So I went into that. By the way, everyone's going to get a copy of these slides if they're going to be, hopefully they'll be useful to you. But as I did mention in the previous steps, that stuff about strategy, that stuff about influence, making sure that you're on the map locally and regionally. And I'll keep stressing it because I'm a northerner. I go on about it all the time. I was going on about it to poor Rochelle before we came in. Regionalism is really, really important. And like often we can get a bit befuddled by this sort of, because funding tends to be national, but actually really stick to your regional guns, because that's what you present. And just like the examples that were given around Cornwall. So now thinking about the funding bid, being through the criteria, We've made that list of what are the key things, which literally takes about 20 to 30 minutes when you do it. You just make bullet points, you know, it doesn't have to be a massive. You've kind of thought about how that cross matches with the work that you want to do. You're ready to go and you're writing it. But I would say we get back to the narrative. What is going to make your bid stick out from other people's bids when you're applying? What is it going to make it pop out? It's actually the narratives around the women and children you support. It's that unique way, the passion, the commitment, everything that you put into the work and the way that you work. Actually, it does matter that if you put on a luncheon club, if you put on in the school holidays, you put some extra, make sure that all the kids that come to your, even if you don't have funding for it, you know, everyone swoops in and makes sure that the kids are fed. Actually, it does matter that you go and meet all the women from the elder women's group when they get out of their taxis outside and help support them in. You know, really think about the full picture of what you're doing, because then funders get an idea of all of that extra added value that you're bringing and the difference that you're making. And then the second part of that around the funding bid part is, it's like I've said before about the edit. And look, like I say, I've done it all myself. I've done all, you know, I've done it through the night, worked through the night, last minute submissions, everything. And now I go back and just think, oh, I really wish that I just timed it a bit better. Talk to your colleagues. Just say, look, we didn't get the funding last time. I am actually going to need to put aside some time. Actually, I'm going to need to work from home that one morning to be able to do this. Give yourself space between the edits. It's the number one thing I would say. It isn't about doing it on day 1, 2, 3. Make sure you've got a few days or even a week between the edits. Get your first draft, get it all out your head, meet all the criteria. It's not going to be the best written thing ever, but you're going to get it all out there. Give yourself a bit of space, go back. That's when you refine it. You go, well, actually, I don't need this. I don't need this. Actually, that hits a nail on the head. And then the third stage is you're perfecting the way that it's presented. You're getting down to your word count so it doesn't seem too stressful. Word count doesn't feel as stressful if you have a bit of time in between the last edit. And just give yourself the space for that if you can. However, I am not underestimating the fact that you are all under incredible pressure and you don't have enough time, but just think about whether you can plan in an hour here, an hour there, an hour there, and just see if your colleagues can support you with that as well. So thanks. Anything anybody wants to share? Any questions that anybody wants to ask after that? And we can come out of this so I can actually see you all as well, which would be nice. All right.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rosie, for sharing such valuable insights and advice there. If you have a question for Rosie, please do raise your hand under the reaction button, or feel free to type it into the chat and we can read it out.
And any comments, if anybody's got any comments or anything that they want to share about their tips, that would be absolutely great. It's hard for me to see if anything's coming through. I don't know whether there's anything in the chat.
I'll keep an eye on the chat and let you know.
Thank you. Does anybody want to share anything about anything that they've found has been really helpful? I mean, I think one of the key things for me that I think we underestimate is getting our voice out there and the influence and the strategy. So I think that it's really, really important, if you can find a way to do it, off the back of a bid that doesn't get through, that you've lost the funding for, and you only put that funding in because it was really critical, yeah, then I think it's really important that you utilize that as you approach the next bid. And the way that you can do that, because obviously it won't necessarily fit into a funding application, the way you can do that, as I've said, is to have that local strategic approach. Just put a few flashes of it in your social media. If you can, put it up on your website, it's a concern. Do a paragraph blog post about it if you can. You know, at your strategy meeting, present the evidence and say, we didn't get funded for this, but actually everybody locally, we're supporting all these women that are sexually exploited, and none of you are supporting them. So if we don't get funding, what impact does that have on you? You never know what from that, what you're going to get is supporters of your bid. So you could get, you know, sometimes you're asked for references, sometimes funders, sometimes agencies recommend you to different funders. So that can really help as well.
We do have some raised hands if you want to take them. Yeah. Please come in. I
can't see them. So Rochelle, would you do it?
Oh, you can't see them. Okay.
I can't see raised hands.
Yeah, sure. Coming to, is it Abby?
Abby, it's Abby, thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. I've switched Brill. Thank you. Rosie, that was amazing. I took so many notes. Yeah, I found it really, really useful. Thank you so much. And really enjoyed hearing questions from people as well. I was just thinking, as a prevention charity, something that we felt has perhaps been a weakness or a perceived weakness previously in applications is that we struggle to provide kind of data around the impact of our work. We're a maternity safety charity, so even though we know we're doing great work, and we do have some data and some numbers, I just wondered if you have any tips for how we could maximize kind of what we have.
An issue, because actually I don't think we are ever scope the amount of preventive work that we do. I mean, this is the thing that really frustrates me with funders, is they don't really understand this. And obviously we don't have like a massive amount of funding to be able to do these amazing social impact reports. What I would say is work backwards. So look at, you're doing prevention for a certain issue, right? So look at the issues of your prevention and then look at the other side of it. So what are the responses to that issue locally? And you will find there are so many problems with that, that like use that as your, because there will be data and there will be evidence. So do, for example, I'll give you an example. Up here in Northumbria, 10 years ago, honour-based abuse, you know, nobody understood it. So as I think we still don't in lots of ways. But one of the things we did was the Freedom of Information Act with Northumbria Police. And that helped us to scope a whole heap of stuff. We were doing preventative work at that point with young women, with groups of women, as well as the advocacy and recovery work, because I think recovery work falls into this as well. And what we did was we went, Freedom of Information shows that we have 350 women who've gone through this, and you have 2 recordings. All right, police, what's up with that? If we weren't doing the preventative, this would be the consequence. So again, I think there's a dual side of that. I think there's the stuff about the strategy and the influence of getting out there and using those stats in your evidence base for the fact that, you know, you need to do the preventative work. And then I think the other side of it is how you're going to present that in your narrative. So again, I think that's strengthening the stuff around the need for it, because the consequences are, I don't know if that's helpful because I don't know exactly what you do, but I have found that that's really worked with a lot of organisations that I've worked with when people haven't recognised their preventative work. So
yeah, that is helpful, Rosie, thank you. And I think also what you mentioned earlier about including kind of qualitative feedback as well can be powerful. So yeah, thank you.
Definitely. Testimonies from the women, nobody can ever argue with that. In fact, you know, something we did, the organisation I was at, and actually other Black minorities women's organisations have done. So local authority won't fund them, won't get anything. You know what they did? So took a whole group of women with their kids to the council chambers. That's sharp changed their mind about stuff. So think about some of the direct things you could be doing to make, you know, so that the women, they have a voice, they have things they want to say. And that was driven by the women, by the way, at the organisation. And that was what was so great. It was driven by the Women's Voices group. They were so sick of people not listening to them. So sometimes there can be these kind of quite clever, simple ways of getting the people's voices across. And then when we did an application, we just said we did this. And actually it was really strong to say, actually, we, you know, 14 women, they wanted to go and speak to the councillors and have their voices heard. Okay.
We've got 3 more questions and we're about 5 minutes before we need to wrap up. So we'll come to Peter, then Saima, and then a question from Polly in the chat.
Yep, just a quick couple of tips that I use. I always sell the dream, not just the bed. So not just what I want to do, but why we want to do it, the difference that the funder will make. And I always make it really clear to the funder, this is the difference they'll make. And I use the beneficiary's voice to explain that difference. So it's about getting the beneficiary to say, this is really what we're going to do. And this is what you can do as our partner, not just our funder, in doing that. And the other tip I always use is use their words. You're seeing.
Yeah. Oh, dear Peter, you appear to have gone off, but you are
They
very...
might not call it domestic violence. Use their words.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Peter. They're good tips there. Thank you. We've got Simon next,
Yes.
and then Abby. Oh no, Abby's been. So Simon's
and
next.
then Polly.
Hi, Rosie. Yeah, we did do that, take over the town hall.
Well
But the issue we cause a bit of a stir. But the issue with that, we've done it a few times, is whilst we've attracting attention, and this is really part of my question, attracting attention is part of that journey. It's just taking it to that next level where we're not just seen as troublemakers, because that's the other flip side to that. So you're just troublemakers, they have their little day in the media, blah blah blah, and then nobody gets back to you because there really is an appetite amongst the elected officials. So how do we bypass that? It's just some tips.
That's very, very good. So this is where you get kind of strategic in how you're presenting yourself. So this goes back to that kind of reviewing your infrastructure a bit. Okay. I always, whenever I'm working with organizations, one of the number one things I think for us all in whatever we're doing is we need to make a protective fortress. We are in a hostile environment and we're often under attack. It's just the reality of the way that we work from many different sides because we challenge. This is how we change society, make things better for women and girls. We have to challenge, and people don't like challenge because they don't like change. But I think one of the things is you have to make a bit of an iron fortress. So what I've found is go back, you know, that infrastructure thing. Take a bit of time, give yourself a bit of a plan. Very simple. It doesn't have to be super complicated. You've got lots of sister organizations. If you don't have the best policy, maybe they can share stuff with you. If you don't have, like, I don't know, the best pathway for something, you know, or some of your systems need a bit of upgrading, you know, maybe you can get some help with that. Or maybe it's just something you can simply do. So get your house completely in order. I'm not saying it's not, by the way, I'm sure it is. But we all have that. We all have things we could be making better. Everything I do, you know, I could be making better. So I think have a quick look at that, right? And then strategically, you go out there, and I think it's about, okay, you challenge, but also you will be the most professional. So when you go to into multi-agency meetings, how come you're the only one who's presenting data and you've got case studies and you've got this and you've got that? I've found things like with your local PCC or local authority, they are going to be having strategy meetings. They might not be your biggest friends. They might be your friends. There are some good multi-agency forums. There are some good PCCs. Northumberland PCC is a good PCC, for example. So I'm not trying to be really negative about the authorities, but they often don't understand our work. But, you know, what we do is we're able to go, well, actually, you want evidence of this? We've got this. You want a page report on this? We've got this. And what you're starting to do, I think, is turn around. Yes, you challenge, and people will be trying to really undermine your service, but actually you're able to show just how professional on top of things you are. Because I bet you have a ton. People always look on specialists, particularly Black and minoritized organizations, as if we're lesser than. But I have never been into a Black and minoritized led organization that isn't heads and shoulders above what many organizations are doing, but they just are under such attack that often they're not able to present that. And I say to them, please present how professional, how amazing, how expert you are. And it goes back to that tip about have confidence in your expertise and everything you're going into, and support your colleagues. So if you've got junior colleagues or younger women, perhaps going into some of these multi-agency meetings, do a bit of prep before they go in, you know, so they have that confidence. I know we've got 2 minutes.
Thanks. Yeah, need to wrap up shortly. So finally from Polly, she's asking about if you could offer some practical tips to help with resilience, to bounce back and not be too deflated for too long.
I think that's got to come. I mean, it comes from our sisterhood within our organisations. It comes from other women, from our collectivist work. It comes from the women and the girls. I think we all go through difficult points in life, but I remember one particularly difficult point. It was so interesting. I just kept bumping into women that I'd worked with in the past, and I can't tell you, and seeing them getting on with their lives and what they've done and like how much they've achieved. So I would say really throw yourself more. Especially I think if you're a manager, you're so busy thinking about the bigger organizational stuff, give yourself some space to just have a women's voices group. You run it. Say, look, we didn't get this bid. What do you think? How do we do it? Get some of that sisterhood and that power back, because I would say that's one of our greatest strengths as a sector that nobody else can do. You know what it's like. It's part of the thing that keeps us going. Like I say, it's not the wages, it's not the career opportunities. It keeps us going because the absolute power of when we come together as survivors, as women, as women's organisations, when we're being good to each other, because I know it doesn't always happen, but when we're being good to each other, the power of our networks and ability to do that and make a bit of effort and a bit of space, we can reap absolute rewards. So things like this conference is a really good example, because you should go away feeling really empowered. So I would say when things are really bad or really get you down, run a group with your women. have them feedback, and you know what, they'll turn around and say, don't listen to those funders or those other people, because we could not survive without you, and we would not even be in the position we're in without you. So whatever happens, we absolutely have your back.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rosie, for that really insightful and useful session. Really appreciate you joining us. I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. We are moving into a closing session now, so we hope you'll join us for that as a chance to have some reflections on the day. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.